Welcome to episode 9 of the Mindedness Revolution. Uh,
Woohoo!
hey, friend, how are you today?
Doing great. Happy to be here, Greg.
Love to join you. And we're talking today about sort of laying out some meta perspectives on Mind 4 kinds of notions. And we started to really think about a meta observer for our psychological self, put some COM-MO language on that, and give that as one pillar of a meta perspective. And then we're going to be going through a systemic one today, an attention one, and ultimately an awareness one. So it's a meta self, meta observer, meta systemic observer, meta attention, and meta awareness. And you're leading us. You led us brilliantly last time. And
Yeah,
today you're going to be taking the reins again and walking us through these various angles on this Mind 4 idea.
beautiful. Thank you, Greg. So yeah, that's the idea of that as we've talked about the maps of mind that are nested in the tree of knowledge or these planes of existence, which for viewers, listeners, go back and listen if you haven't heard those. And then we're talking about this next layer of recursion of mind, and that these are features that you and I as human beings can develop, right? And so
Totally.
um, if and I try to almost give this language of the to make it a little more fun and hopefully a little less stodgy and serious of like what are the superpowers, right? What are the
Hmm.
superpowers of these
Totally.
things? And so, like a metacognitive capacity would mean you have the ability to look at your thoughts and feelings and perceptions and to reflect on those as we talked about in more of a calm MO way. We can look at our own psychological sense of ego and persona and our embodied self, look at parts. We talked a little bit about that last time
Yep.
of like how to integrate those things and find the parts of ourselves that felt left out that are going to still cause you a problem and bring
Amen to
them
that.
in.
Right.
Yeah.
And we can
Uh,
identify it. We'll just so when we shine the light in our own selves, the experiential self that goes into our primate animal existence, all the way
mhm,
into our organism. How we're feeling. That's where that is. Images, urges, those kinds of things. Our narrator, internal narrator, sense of identity really comes online in adolescence, and our felt sense of our public persona, how other people are going to see us.
mhm.
Those are different audiences, and the shining the light of COM-MO is really looking at how those things are gripping in the world that you're in, and seeing if you can kind of see how they're maybe conflicting,
Mhm.
if there are any neurotic loops, and how we might untangle those with curiosity, acceptance, loving compassion, and motivated toward valued states of being.
Right. So if you almost think of metacognitive capacities, you're kind of or psychological mindfulness or calm MO, you're reflecting on these intrapersonal and
Yep,
interpersonal, like how we are even
exactly.
relating. And a metasystemic is its superpower is I almost think of it as um, it's not limited to, but it includes the capacity to see or model empirically nested systems of systems.
Exactly.
Um, and then two terms that I'll talk a little more about hyperobjects and hypersubjects.
Mm.
And so, you know, I think first pass to kind of say what, with our regular eyes and our regular mind and our
Yep.
regular mind three, um, what are examples of what maybe isn't meta systemic,
Mm-hmm.
or what we're just used to ordinarily seeing as a default. So I think about let's talk about systems, objects, and subjects. So
Lovely.
systems, objects, and subjects.
Yep.
So systems, there's a variety of cultural systems, or political, philosophical, or religious systems. If you think about it, we all inherited some type of version of that from whoever
Mm-hmm.
we grew up with. It's not uncommon. We may not have even examined them that much. And we find ourselves in an interesting time where these different systems now around the planet have the access within us and between us to start to interact. And so there's conflict that occurs, right? And so you
Totally.
either isolate or you find some kind of plurality to
Mm-hmm.
find respect for them, or perhaps various types of synthesis or integration, sort of various types of projects or reactions or responses that people have. But first pass, if and not to insult anybody listening, but the idea is if you just have a various system or way of looking at things, and you can't find any way that it relates to the quote the other, you're probably not looking metasystemically, at least at that issue.
Totally.
So let's talk about objects. So
Okay.
objects, in a very simple way, first pass. If I'm looking over at a chair right now, so I look at that chair, and I think of it as being solid, separate, independent, and static. Right? It's the
Mhm.
instinct of my own perceptual motor, sensory motor loop to
Yep.
say that's how it is. Right? And even the
Totally.
Buddhists were very good at saying that's not quite how it goes. Right? So even that chair had prior causes. So
Mm,
there had to be a chair builder. There had to be, if it's made of wood, there had to be trees to cut down those trees. And then somebody had to cut the wood, right? And then there
totally.
may be screws or nails or whatever you're using to connect the pieces of wood. And then there's fabric, right? So there's all the prior causes to create the parts. And then, by the
Yep.
way, the chair is not just its own entity, it's actually made of parts that are integrated. And then an interesting one that's why I threw in about the Buddhists is then they also talk about the imputation of the mind. So it's not just the object over there, but it's also
Mhm.
then the interaction of
Totally.
you and
What
your
you,
mindedness with this object, right?
100%.
Um,
It
so
looks it
so
looks different to you than it does a termite, we'll say.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Right. Our own
Uh,
biocognitive,
mhm.
mind one frame and mind two frame are going to make us even see and experience something very different, in fact, from that perspective.
Right.
And the Buddhists also then do that with subjects, right? The idea, and also psychodynamic theory, a variety of theories of, we tend to think and look at ourselves as solid, separate, independent, and static subjects, right?
Mhm.
But we can challenge that as well, right? That
Totally.
we are made of their prior causes and conditions, which you could go all the way back to the beginning or whatever we want to call it, the primordial parts of the universe to
Mhm.
life, to material development, life, minded animals, culture persons, or just a little more proximal, our parents. There
Totally.
are these prior causes. We're made of parts all the way from a sense of our various organ systems to the features of mind that we're talking about, the kind of the mindedness features. Um, and in a sense, as we get more into some of these other practices, that the self itself is a construction and
Mhm.
and made of prior causes and conditions, and there are things that can be done to deconstruct and reconstruct that
Right.
in a non-woo-woo naturalistic way. And
Totally.
so just first pass seeing systems, objects, and subjects. Welcome to the club. That's what we all do. That's our default. And so a metasystemic impulse is actually to look a little deeper and examine that. So let's play with that, right? So if we
Mhm.
were looking
Mhm.
at if we're trying to look more metasystemically, and I do not think of this as a binary, you have it or you don't.
Right. Mhm.
It's more a dynamic dimensional feature, right? There are
Right.
times where any one of us could be a little more metasystemic, and there are other
Yep.
times we're more psychologically contracted, and we're probably
Mhm.
not. Okay.
Mhm.
So to kind of give some, and to also be really clear, you or I are not like putting the final word on what metasystemic is or mind four. We're trying to
Oh,
introduce and put an overview and saying this is what we've explored so far and what we found.
exactly.
So let's look at systems, objects, and subjects and talk about actually systems of systems, hyperobjects, and hypersubjects.
Okay.
So first, systems of systems. So this would be thinking about how systems themselves, and you could, in what happens once you do this, you can't unsee it of sorts, is how anything is kind of like a system embedded in a matrix of other systems,
Totally.
right? And
Mhm.
I think a very straightforward one that we've already brought up, so I would bring this up for our audience, would even be what you would call the tree of knowledge, that there are these
Mm.
planes of existence. If we just objectively look at behavior all the way from particles all the way up the complexification stack, that each of these systems are in a deep continuity with a discontinuity where there's a new emergence layer, but at each level, right? So even say at the level of life, and we look at an organism, well, that organism is embedded in an environment, it's embedded in an ecology with other
T-
organisms, right? So
totally.
at each level or plane of existence, there's these systems of systems in interaction, and then they're also in this complexification stack. So I think that's a
Absolutely.
very beautiful zoomed out version of kind of looking at systems of systems. I would go so far. I would also go and say, part of for folks not familiar with Utah, the kind of the Utah three vectors of knowledge, to actually look at different ways of knowing, like to know subjectively and objectively,
Hmm.
um, and intersubjectively and transjectively, as you look at how these are in a dynamical move.
Totally.
I bring that up because some of our conversation flips right into a
Yep.
transjective state where we're talking about objective stuff, and then all of a sudden we're talking about mind and feelings. And yes, that's intentional. It's not that we're
Absolutely.
lost. We're intentionally trying to have this kind of transjective conversation and cognition and way of being in the world.
Totally.
So,
Let me,
so
if I
yeah,
can,
go
just
for
let
it.
me pop in real fast on the sort of the systems of systems.
Yeah,
um,
love it.
so, folks out there, somebody may have heard of Yuri Bronfenbrenner. He's a famous psychologist who basically is a social systemic psychologist that developed the social ecological model. And this gives us a way of thinking about some of these layers. So the way he talked about it, um, was that they're at the highest layer of abstraction, they're macro systems. And you can put them like nations within at least the nation you start there, United States, for example, religion, Christianity. Would be another example. And so just these are then worldviews that sort of give you fundamental stories and assumptions about the world, and basic scripts of national identity, religious identity. Then within that, you can then drop into what he called the meso layer, basically the layer of community. So the
Mm.
layer of where do you go to school? What neighborhood are you in? This would relate to the sort of where you fall in the socioeconomic status, general locale within, say, a nation, within a state, even the meso layer. And then the micro layer of the system is like, what house are you born in, and what family are you
Mm.
in? What are the actual relations that you have? So one way to think about it, just at scale level, is the micro relations that you have, that you see, you interact with. The meso community that you're in is nested. You're nested in that, and that's then nested in a larger macroscopic system, and that might be a nation, and on one angle, a religion on another. So that gives you the scale of systems at the culture person plane. Gives a way to frame that. So then, if we're starting to think about systems of systems, hyper objects in relation, this gives you at least a way to see those patterns.
That's great, Greg. Yeah, to even for folks that may have heard some of this so far and say, "Did I get too abstract?" I mean, I couldn't help myself, even in, say, medical care, right? So as a physician, I'm trying to administer care for somebody, determine appropriate a treatment, um, both empirically based and scientifically based, and then I go try to get insurance coverage and I get a denial, right? And then I'm trying to sort things out with insurers and their various stakeholders. There's also, because I work in an academic university, there's various stakeholders within the university, from the micro meso levels within an organization that I work for, and to see this interaction of systems, and actually learning to, if you will, up level how you play the game, right?
Right.
So that I used
Right.
to find myself constantly frustrated because I didn't actually have the capacity to see how these systems of systems interacted. And not that I've mastered it at this point, but as I'm able to do it better, I'm
Right.
able to more accurately know where to nudge and where to kind of ease off, like that this is not a place I can push, where I can
Totally.
leverage and where I can't. Yeah. So
Great. Great.
um, good. So the next one, talking about hyper objects, which
Yep.
I think it was Timothy Morton who
Introduce
first
that
talked
term
about
to.
hyper objects. For folks not familiar, it would describe objects such as global warming or the climate as a hyper object, as a type of object massively distributed in time and space relative to humans.
Totally.
So, and that's an important way. It's a powerful idea, right? To actually say, perhaps there's probably more hyper objects we don't even know about, right? And there's the few that we do. And so something like global warming or climate change really does stretch the imagination and the modeling capacity of a culture person to try to understand what the heck is going on, right?
Totally.
And so it's certainly an easy target. Hyperobjects are an easy target for confusing people based on evidence of what is or what isn't, and so but just without getting too much into that, the idea that there are hyper objects out in the world, and arguably it's important as we're cultivating a type of mind four and a mind that can recurse on itself and model the complexity of that's here and apparent in a better way, that being able to model hyper objects are important for our collective well-being. And so at a matter edging of life, we could talk about climate. You could talk about evolution of life at the living plane of existence. But it's also interesting to think, we're talking about the mindedness revolution, to think about, well, what is that? What does a hyper object look at the mindedness and culture plane of existence? So as I
Amen.
was kind of thinking about this, I was like, if mindedness is something that emerged out of living organisms with a complex nervous system, and that this may have started back in the Cambrian
Totally.
explosion over
Yep.
500 million years ago. I had this kind of imaginal mental simulation of like thinking about like right now, right? Like all the way from squirrels to any form of living animal right now. There's these mind's eye around the entire planet, just
Totally.
looking and interacting and engaging with the world.
Exactly. That's
Whoa.
really right. Right. So that's a great place to start. So maybe people, it's a hyper object. Okay. So then you went back to the chair, and then I'll just say you actually right. I'll use a little Ian McGilchrist here and argue that
Mm,
whether it really breaks down to the hemisphere is a good question, but you definitely have a cognitive task to pull out a
mm,
pattern entity in a background of a field. Like that's what an animal needs to do this in a different way than a plant because of movement. And it's got to find its prey, it's got to find its mate. And so what it does is it pulls out the pattern object, like the chair or the mate. And so it has this capacity to scheme and pull and match to that, and then abstract that is the thing that it is tracking. And really, the left hemisphere is going to particulate that, and the right hemisphere
mhm,
is contextualize that. But that's the entity field relation. And now we're going to take that perceptual capacity, and we humans can symbolically tag it with a noun and then move it with a verb and compare it to others with adjectives. Notice that's the grammar actually allows us to pull that up. And then we start talking about these entities as propositions. And in the
mhm,
modern world, right, when this whole system is this capacity for abstraction and communication is so intense, we have this tendency to sort of reify, oh, there's the climate, right? Or the
mhm,
United States, even, or the
mm,
financial trade world. What is the International Monetary Fund? Well, we can point to an institution, but like, do we actually know? Oh my God, think about how incredibly complex that is. So we draw a little circle on it, we pull it out, we call it an entity, that object, right? But that the
mhm,
complexification of that thing, and then the ease with which we abstract and lose sight of the fact that it means so much to so many different people, is part of what I think Timothy Morton's getting at. But that helps us see your point about why us as minded, oh, there's entities and fields. That's actually the way we're minded. This system is built, is to
mhm.
see the entity relative to the field. And that allows us to both see hyperobjects, but by the way, also confuse you to think that you can see them, when in fact, what you're really gripping relative to what is a very, very small aspect of that.
That's beautiful, Greg. Yeah. Yeah. So again, I think this is a fascinating way to play and think about it, as opposed to a well-formed, finished process. We're at the beginning, right? And so um, again, that we don't want to overly reify. We want to have the capacity to look at parts and wholes. And the tendency you pointed out with Ian McGilchrist is that we tend to lean towards more looking at parts and short short periods of time and space, essentially, rather than extended space and time, and the interaction at multiple levels, within level and between levels. And that can get us in a little trouble, where we may not be modeling in an effective way, and we end up with things just literally over our heads
Totally.
without an attempt to, borrowing from Robert Keegan, we're in over our heads and not looking to kind of level up. And this is
Yep.
actually arguably we can level up a little bit. Yeah.
I'll give one more example, and then we maybe begin to bring this to a close, at least if we're, or summarize the key elements. But
Yeah.
what I like to say, my first intellectual awakening is feminism. I took a course, one guy, 10 women in a course called really focuses on gender studies, what they now call women's studies, and became aware of the system that I was in that justified the world through a particular lens, namely a white male lens. And I
Mm.
wasn't, I'd sort of got that, but I didn't live it and I didn't see it. And I get meta reflective on the system of justification that I was a part of. So that's just an example. That wasn't getting me psychology, although I could see how my ego and persona had a set of
Mhm.
assumptions. But really, I could see really a higher abstraction of system of justification that was driving it, and the feminist scholars ship that I read and the points was like woke me up to seeing the
Mm.
system that I was embedded in from a meta-reflective perspective. So that's just an example of how you might be when it comes online. What does it look like? What's an
That's
opacity
right.
transparency shift? And that's an example of that.
Yeah. So outside of maybe the scope of this podcast episode, but you can then start to apply that to justifications and our systems, to your point. And actually, just as we're talking about, a Mind4 has the capacity to work on the schemas of oneself intrapersonally and in an interrelated fashion. You're starting to look at the schemas you're embedded in, including your justification systems. So we can actually, in a beautiful way, actually start to reevaluate, why do I continue to believe, or why do we, because you're not alone in your justification. Well, you could be, but generally we're embedded together. And so
Right,
why
we're a
are we
couple of
looking
days
at
away
it
from an
this way?
election here, right? That's probably on
That's right.
people's mind. I mean, this will be
Yeah.
post-election that we post this, but people
It'll be
will know,
post-election.
you know.
But
But
my easy one that I trigger all my friends and family with is like, if you hate Trump or Kamala, then you've been hacked.
yeah,
And people hate when I say that, but I'm
yeah,
like, I'm not saying you have to like them. There's a difference. But if you truly hate them and you think the end of the world is coming because either one gets in, you've been hacked, right? And so I may trigger somebody who's listening, but evaluate that a little bit. Last one I want to mention before we kind of
right.
wrap up this one is what I would call the hyper subjects. And so just as we could look at an object massively distributed over space and time, that if you do that enough, something weird happens to you. And it happened to me many years ago, where you actually, it comes back in on you, and you realize it's not just the world out there made of these systems of systems, these hyper objects, but that you actually, as a subject, are also distributed, massively distributed through space and time. And it causes a shift in identity, agency, and responsibility. And so we can talk more about what is that like from the interior, but I'm also saying you can see that as a cultural behavior in people. I don't know if people can see my shirt, but this is one I wear to remind me:
Right.
birthplace, earth, uh, race, human, politics of freedom, and religion of love. And I don't take
Lovely.
any of that lightly.
Yeah,
I mean, I
no
mean it.
doubt.
And
Right.
so I would just
That's
mention
beautiful.
three potential features of a hyper subject that you might see.
Mm-hmm.
I would call it changes in identity, agency, and responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically with identity, that there can be a transpersonal component to it,
Yes.
where now I feel I am still personal, but I am now also transpersonal, in terms of I see my relationship in the stack, all
Right.
the way from matter, spaceship Earth, the life, the ecosystems were embedded in the mind, this hyper object of all these minded animals, including ourselves, and the culture and the digital. And so, second part to that, of that identity, would be this technology enhanced identity, rather
Yep.
than saying, part of a whole other conversation, but that we're not anti-tech, that technology is a part of nature, and that
Mm-hmm.
it's embedded in nature. In many ways, we could be a type of technology in itself, which is another
Mm-hmm.
conversation. But that we're not anti-technology. It's, in fact, how do we learn to come together with wisdom and use technology in a
Totally.
wise way. And then the agency, I would just mention that, people get sometimes, I love hearing, oh, I don't listen to it as much, but the free will conversations, and is there free will and is there not? And it's like, well, it's almost like interdependent free will, right? That there is a distributed agency. I don't tell what my liver or kidneys what to do. I didn't come up with Christianity, but it influenced me heavily, particularly growing up, right? So there's top down and bottom up features affecting the agency at a personal level. So
Totally.
ideally, a hyper subject actually becomes aware of their kind of
Mm,
interdependent will,
lovely.
and that our technology, including our
Mm,
phones and other things, will play a role in our agency. Again, part of a whole other conversation. And then the ethical responsibility. So as you start
mm,
to see yourself, or let's say if you look at someone and their
mhm,
cultural behavior, you can
mhm,
see that they actually care about things beyond their lifetime. They
mm,
feel, they don't, it's not a should, they
mhm,
feel the
mhm,
ethical responsibility to
mhm.
care. They care about everything because they realize in essence part of who they are is everything.
Yep.
And they, as a hyper subject, they see themselves as a focality in the totality, and they actually care about everything. And so they're supremely selfish because they
Mm.
care about everything. And so those are three features I would say we might as a speculation see as this change in transpersonal technological identity, distributed agency, and this kind of world centric, cosmos centric, where I'm
That's
expanding beyond.
That's really beautiful. Let me give you. I'll chime in my own example on this. So just for people, so it's metasystemic, systems of systems, hyper objects, and how we think about them in the nested, and hyper subject from that first person perspective. In
Mm,
terms of what happens with the unified theory of knowledge, this system in originally tree of knowledge, and this it pulls you to see all of this and then pulls you as a participant distributed across them, all of this. And one way that manifested for me was, well, wait a minute, how do I fit in the part, and how does the whole relate to me, and what are the themes that might be ethically organizing, and ultimately gives rise to the ultimate justification, which is be that which enhances
mhm,
dignity, well-being with integrity, which is sort of this fractal of subjective ethics that I pulled off of and looked to see, hey, if I were distributed in a particular kind of way, and by the way, as a psychotherapist, relative to holding a patient in a society, making judgments, where across all of this can I hold a particular value system? And that's what emerged. I'm not saying that's the right one, but I'm saying that be that which enhances dignity and well-being with integrity turns out to be, and that's, to me, that would be the example of kind of a hyper subject mentality, right? It's sort of like, okay, where am I? Where are we? We're all of this. And what are our interests? So dignity, well-being, integrity, actually, there are good reasons to argue that that's a kind of fractal value. And
mhm.
so then that's me, and I embrace that in this part. I'll just throw that out there as what might be an example of sort of a hyper subject mentality.
Right, right. I love that, Greg. And so that, part of this discussion, and as we continue to explore and unpack um, the mindedness revolution, Mind4, we're walking people through, descriptive metaphysics, metapsychology, metaphenomenology. We're actually trying to build, and you've done so much of it with you talk, we're trying to build a language which then we can, as a type of its own justification system, and owning that that's what it is, actually start to connect people that are striving for something deeper. I think they
Right.
feel the impulse. Like I ethically have a harder time, with patients just saying be. People say I want to be normal, and I say, oh my God, please don't do that. Be adaptive. Be adaptive. And we live in an insane time. Uh,
Right.
things have never been better and they've never been worse. So
Right.
let's adapt, right? And so
Totally.
we're trying to build a language and an approach and a way of being and a way of relating to get folks together and to own the whole stack, right? But then allows us to cultivate that kind of wisdom into this new the phase we find
100%.
ourselves
I
in.
love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really beautiful. All right, friend. I think we have provided at least the outline of part two in our pillars of Mind
Mhm.
4 MetaMind perspectives. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for walking that through. So, metasystemic, how we see the systems, the subjects, and the objects in the world from this kind of vantage point. That's really beautiful.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All
Greg.
right. All right. Take care.
Till next time.
Next time.